The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Or Undrip.
Undrip is the result of many years of Indigenous resistance to unfair persecution and oppression based on their identities.
In 1920, Indigenous world leaders traveled to the League of Nations to try and gain recognition of their treaties from the international community.
In response, the League of Nations rejected their requests.
It became clear that the international community did not recognize Indigenous nations as true nations.
Their treaty rights were deemed to be a domestic matter.
Adding to the oppression and awful history that had already transpired, it would be 64 years before any true change on this position occurred.
In 1984, the UN finally came together to produce a first draft of what would be named the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
In 1994, Undrip was approved by the Subcommission on the Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities.
In 2006, the Undrip Working Group submitted its final draft to the UN Human Rights Council.
On September 13, 2007, Undrip is voted in by the General Assembly with an overwhelming majority vote.
After initially rejecting Undrip, the Canadian government formally supported Undrip in 2010.
Under new leadership, in 2015, the Canadian government went further in committing to implement Undrip, barring conflict with the existing Canadian Constitution and Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Courts use Undrip to interpret Canadian law, using concepts such as free, prior, and informed consent as benchmarks for vague constitutional standards which don't explicitly explain the extent of consultation necessary when working with Indigenous peoples.
Highlights of rights affirmed by Undrip are rights to access without discrimination, customs, traditions, ceremonies, spirituality, and firm commitments by member states to reconciliation.
In addition, Undrip affirms and reaffirms human rights, rights to self-determination, and political status.
Undrip represents a very progressive starting point for decolonizing governments, government processes, and the way nations think about Indigenous peoples worldwide.